Right, we got some people joining. We're just going to start opening the doors here. So while people are coming in, let me know where you're from. Today, I'm going to give away one of my books to the person who is farthest away from Portland, Oregon. And we might have to get into a map or debate. So I'll have Julianne settle it using Google if I can't do it off the top of my head. So let me know who's here, where you're from. First contestant's from Dallas. Good to see you, Jacques. Indiana. All right, Austin. Austin's just a little closer. Milwaukee. You already have the book. Okay, Angie, thank you. Hey, Lisa in Princeton. I think you've got one too. Connecticut. All right. So for folks that are just joining, just for my fun and amusement, because I love geography, whoever's the farthest away, I'm gonna mail one of my books to. Frank's in Connecticut. Ben's got the book too. Yay. Oak Park. All right. Let's see. I think Princeton right now has the edge. Well, depending on where you are in Connecticut, Bernard, you might want to put your city in for me. And actually, Frank as well. I think I know where you're at, but we'll see. Princeton has a copy. All right, West Hartford. So far, the contender. Okay, we're going to give folks one more minute to join, and then we'll kick it off. Anybody outside of the U.S.? All right. Julie, we had a good spot to kick off?
Yeah, I think we're good to go. Did you decide the winner then? So it's going to be Frank?
Right now, it looks like it's Frank. We'll have to go through the script just to make sure, but I think so.
Cool.
Anyone can beat West Hartford from Portland, Oregon. Maria's in San Francisco. You're a close flight from me. All right. Well, I think unless somebody joins in the next couple of minutes from a greater distance right now, the contender on the podium is Frank. So we'll get a copy out to you. Just uh, afterwards, you've got my contact info. Just shoot me a note with your address, and I'll ship one off to you. All right, folks. Thank you for joining today. Really excited about this conversation. We're going to kind of shift the pattern from what we've been doing into some more financial discussion in terms of how we're going to build our business case for change. I think most of the folks that are on the call are already familiar with me, but if anyone is new, my name is Aric Wood. I authored the Strategy Activation Playbook. This book was built based on about 25 years of experience leading the change consultancy Explain, working as a strategy consultant at Bain& Company, and standing up strategies as an executive within tech companies, including Intuit. So broad experience in working with large global organizations to bring change to life. And what I've been trying to do is share some of the best practices that I've observed in that journey. Where we're at today. So we're at a transition point. The last couple of webinars have been very much how to do change activation. And we're now pivoting to how to fund change activation. So for this next conversation, what I really want to focus on is how do we build a business case for change? We've spent the money on the consultants to get the strategy. We've done the work internally to build a great change activation program. And now what we're focusing on doing is bringing that to life with a business case so that we can actually get that CFO to sign the check to fund that activation plan that we know is so critical to bring it to life. So to do that, we're going to do a couple things. First, I want to talk about the expected value of tipping the transformation scale. So we don't need to activate everybody in the company, but there is a sweet spot, and we need to be able to build that broad case for where that sweet spot is and how much we need to invest to get there. We're going to talk about the role of change activation itself in realizing transformation and ROI. So specifically making that business case for the CFO that this is actually a strategic investment, and here's why, and here's the data to support that. We're going to dig into some of the top sources for finding ROI for resourcing your change activation. So every transformation is different, but I'm going to give you a couple of examples of places that you can go looking to say, here's a place that we can really leverage to build this business case. And then we're going to share a method for crafting a persuasive business case for change, including sharing with folks that have joined today the business case canvas, which is a tool that you can use to start to design your own business case. So that's where we're headed. Um, before we dive in, as is my habit, I kind of want to get a sense of the room. So, my question today is this: which investments are easiest to resource for your change initiatives? What I'm looking for here, if you're a change leader, what are the things that you typically are able to invest in as you're about to launch a major transformation and you're recognizing that you need resources to bring it to life? So go ahead and check any that apply. Um, just check those that you find that you're regularly able to fund, resource, or enact in your organization. I am so curious about this. I've never asked this question before, so we'll see where people land.
So we just have a few more people to respond. We should be good in 2 seconds.
All right.
All right, I'll share the results.
What do we got? All right. So, change communications are the big winner. So, 71% of you say that that's relatively easy to resource, which is good. That feels like a baseline that we need to have. Followed by learning and development. So, let's not only communicate what we're doing, but let's build the capabilities to make that happen. That's 57, just a slight majority, but that tells me there's still 43% of you that don't find it easy to even build capability building budgets. Change ambassador and champion programs about the same. We got a tie there, and that is, I would argue, a very critical step as well. Um, this is the one that really scares me: leadership alignment activities at only 14%. So those of you that follow me on LinkedIn, one of my recent platforms is that I really am trying to build a case for why change needs to be a C-suite led activity to build a culture of change in the organization to make it a corporate competitive advantage. And this is something that shows up in the statistics all the time, that this is actually one of the weakest points for change activation. So building leadership alignment, 14% right now. Employee engagement activities, generally about 50%, about half of you. That's great. And then culture activation activities, only 7%. I know there might be a little bit of overlap in those two categories, but it gives us a good sense. And I am thrilled to see that at least a third of you get the resources to do some stakeholder research. As you know, if you've attended the prior webinars, this is a cornerstone of the work, as far as I'm concerned. Generally, however, what we're looking at is basically only about half of these things are relatively easy to get done, and very few people are able to do all of them. So we want to explore a little bit about why is that. Let me see if I can close this poll. There we go. And then let's move to the next slide. Okay. So why is this? The bottom line, as I talk to leaders in the industry, and I think this will probably resonate for you, is CFOs don't fund speculative investments. And speculative investment is sort of their phrase, right? We don't think it's a speculative investment, but the reality is we have a hard time defending the dollars. And it's for a couple reasons. First off, change activation is hard to measure. We hear this all the time. I'm looking at change. I'm looking at the KPIs. I'm looking at the NPS score moving. I'm looking at the sales and productivity. I'm looking at cost savings. These are things that we already have measurement systems for. But we don't have good measurement systems yet for things like employee engagement, culture shift, adoption speed. So right now, from a CFO's perspective, these are blind spots, and therefore, if there's not data, I can't actually invest against that. Without those clear metrics, CFOs really struggle to justify the spend in traditional business terms. The other problem we have is a perception problem, which is that a lot of what we do is considered soft stuff, right? This soft stuff story is unfortunate because it really, as we all know, is actually the hard stuff. And it's the hard stuff that leads to the ROI outcomes we want. So if the CFO is viewing it as intangible rather than essential, and they see hard investments like technology, infrastructure, operational improvements having a clearer financial outcome, we need to make a better case that that soft stuff is actually strategic to achieving the hard stuff. It is part of the strategy. We need to do those activities to realize those outcomes that we're targeting. And then lastly, and increasingly, we have enough data and knowledge now to be able to build a business case for change. We need to start flexing that muscle. So if CFOs are working under that perception that change management is just training or internal communications, they're probably underestimating the strategic value of what we do. And what makes it worse is that oftentimes we don't get to come to them for our ask until late into the initiatives. So when we come in late to the initiatives, they might see change management as an add-on rather than a core part of the strategy. So we really need to be thinking about how do we move our conversation about the business case earlier in the process and embed it as an enabling strategic function in the realization of the total business case for the transformation. So what we're going to spend a little bit of time on now is starting to think about how we can frame that differently for folks. We've seen this slide before, but it's relevant again. We know from my book, I said roughly 80% of strategies fail, which comes from a number of different sources. McKinsey has pegged it at 70%. Other people said it's higher or lower. Generally, we see there's an 80-20 rule with these, which is that we're going to spend a whole bunch of money on consultants or internal resources to develop a strategy, but we tend not to fund the activation that's going to bring it to life. And partly that's because we haven't been able to build the business case that activation is important. So what I want to do is two things. I'm going to do an illustrative model to give us a sense of how we can start thinking about change activation's role in achieving the ROI. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some evidence-based approaches that you can use to actually build your specific business case. So my dad was a math teacher, by the way. I didn't necessarily inherit his capabilities and his skills, so this is somewhat Greek and scary to me. But what I would like to unpack is what is actually a fairly simple way to think about quantifying the expected value of any change and transformation effort. So by definition, expected value is the anticipated value of an investment at some point in the future. And it's derived by calculating the possible outcomes by the likelihood that that outcome will occur. So if we take our 20, our 80-20 rule that we just talked about, we know that there are a spectrum of scenarios that can happen. There's a base case that we are aware of where it's most likely that an organization that does nothing is going to fall into that 80% that fails. There's also on the other side that group that probably did something that's going to end up on that end of the spectrum where they're going to be successful. And then something in the middle. So what we're going to do is build three business cases just to illustrate this so we can better understand this. We look at the base case first, right? So we're going to make no investment in strategy activation. Let's imagine that we've got a company, they've just spent $1 million to develop a new enterprise strategy for the business. The strategy is calling for some technology investments and some other structural investments that have hard costs of around $10 million. So we know we're now $11 million into the spend. But the model that the CFO develops says, hey, if we do this well and we're successful, we're going to have a $50 million return on this investment. So that's pretty attractive, right? We as change leaders know, however, that if you don't do any of these things we're advising you to do, you've only got a 20% chance of success. So the expected value formula from the prior slide would suggest we take a 20% chance of achieving that 50 million outcome. We take an 80% chance that we don't reach that, and we have spent $11 million to give us an $11 million loss. And the expected value equation suggests, well, then this is worth at this point about 1.2 million. Not a very high ROI if we really calculate this out. Let's look now at an introduction to adding some dollars into this mix for activating our strategy. So I'm actually making those investments to engage people around communications, capability building, culture shifts that need to happen. In this case, we take the same numbers. We still spend $1 million on the strategy. We still have that 10 million of hard costs, but we add 250,000 to the budget, about 25% of the strategy spend, which is, by the way, the sort of benchmark that I put in my book as sort of base case. We spend 250, one quarter of what we paid to our consulting firm on the strategy activation. And with a higher percent assumption around our strategy being successful, let's say it's 50-50 now. So if we've got a 50% chance of hitting that 50 million target and a 50% chance of actually losing even more money, 11.25 million, our expected value turns out to be 19.5 million. So 16 times the base case. Our chances are getting better. And if we go to the best case example, let's just say for to be crazy, we spend as much on our activation effort to bring the strategy that we spent $2 million on to life in our organization of 50,000 employees. We invest $1 million as well on the activation activities to do that, achieve that outcome. And we think that $1 million is going to put us in that category of the 20% that are successful. So we've got an 80% chance of success. We now look at 80% chance at that 50 million. We net out the cost of the 20% risk that we've now spent 12 million for nothing. And we've got a $37.8 million new case. That's 30 times the base case. So what this illustrative model is suggesting is that the more we invest in strategy activation, we have significantly higher chances of achieving that outcome that we want. And I recognize that, this is an illustrative example, but the reality is that the data actually supports this. So we're going to talk about that in a second. The idea being we need to, for our organization, understand how much investment is required to actually reach that tipping point that's going to start putting us into that category. Now, the tricky bit about this, and the reason I used an illustration in this model rather than hard data, is that every one of your transformations is going to be different. So depending on whether this is enterprise-wide, depending whether this is a departmental change, depending on whether or not your organization is resistant to change or sort of more adaptive, all of those factors are going to go into figuring out what you need to spend for your initiative. But directionally, the model is correct, which is as a percentage, the strategy activation dollars have an outsized return in terms of the ability to generate the total returns for the enterprise. We know from a reliable source that this is true. So this is data that was developed by McKinsey. London, Madner, and Scarrett, specifically, three partners in McKinsey, did a study. They looked at 60 global companies that had 2-year long transformation efforts, or more in some cases. And so looking at 60 companies that had been spending 2 years to do major transformations, they also studied how much did they invest and how many people did they reach inside the organization. So how many employees did we engage? And their data was really telling. What we learned was that relative to their peers, those organizations that only engaged 6% or fewer of their employees were actually likely not only to be in the losing category, but to lose more than their peers in their benchmark peer group. So, and that's because the expected value equation said you're going to be in the category where this money you're spending is going to go to waste. So they actually lost money in these cases, in this case measured by total return to shareholders. What they learned was there was a tipping point among this universe of 60. And the tipping point was if you get to 7% employee engagement around a transformation, you start to see that curve happen, what we just saw in those expected value calculations. So you at 7 to 13%, that group actually outpaced their peer group by 18% total return. And it increased as you went deeper. So you went to 30 as you got to 14 to 20, and you went to 67% as you got into the 21% and above category. So solid evidence that making these investments and engaging more employees in the movement we're trying to create are going to generate outsized outcomes for our transformation. So with that as a foundation, I'm going to dive into the role of activation in creating and realizing those results. Some of this content is going to be a little bit of a refresher for folks, but I think it's important that we go through it quickly, and then we'll dive into some of the actual sources of ROI and how to build a business case. So just as a refresher, for those that might be new to this, the definition that I use for strategy and change activation is this. Activation is the art and science of persuading people to align around, engage with, and adopt new ways of working in order to achieve a shared vision. And so back to that McKinsey data, we know that the people function is one of the most correlated elements of whether we're going to achieve that transformation or not. We need to create a movement. And the problem that we also have right now is that the world is moving against us. Change fatigue is real, and it's getting even harder to do this work. So, from Gartner, we've learned that over the last decade, the number of change and transformation efforts inside of companies is increasing. And at the same time, and we see this every day, the engagement level is decreasing. So we've got organizational support falling as we're asking people to do more change. And what this creates is an activation gap. There's this area here, which is what I called in the book the activation abyss. This is where strategies go to die. So what we need to do is start to shift the way we do change. We need to have a more tailored, human-centered approach to doing it. We've got to move from being a tops-down forcing function with static and stale content, kind of one-size-fits-all programs, which we like to call one-size-fits-none, lacking visibility and insights to course correct all the things we've talked about in the last couple of webinars, to moving towards an activating function. We need to use more engaging, more personalized, more bite-sized content that's relevant to each user. We need to personalize and target that. So not talking to the entire organization, but talking specifically to the product managers in Australia versus the sales folks in EMEA and so on, because they all need different messages and capabilities. We need to build in two-way interactions and feedback so that we're understanding what's working, what's not, what are the good ideas that we could bring in, how could we make it better, and so we can make course corrections. And we need to have those real-time measurements and insights, not things that we're only going to see every 3 to 6 months, because we need to be able to course correct regularly. So to do that, we need to fund change activation. And change activation really has sort of three core ingredients. It's universally true with the companies we're working with. First, you've got to have that transformation strategy, right? So that strategy that you just paid for from Bain or McKinsey or BCG or your consulting partners or you developed internally, that's your starting point, but it's nowhere near the finish point. We then need to go on to actually developing an activation plan that defines the campaign to support the adoption, creating that movement for employees to bring that strategy to life. And then loosely called a platform, we need to have some sort of a platform to actually execute that activation change. So where are we communicating? Where are we giving the capability building, the learning and development? Where are we enacting the culture change? Where are we gathering the data and the feedback? So each organization that does this needs to assemble the pieces and parts to have that platform so that the change leaders can effectively execute their program. If we do that, we can now start to move people up the activation curve. So regardless of what your approach is, whether you're using ProSize AdCar or Cotter or McKinsey, all humans sort of learn and adopt new ways of working in the same manner. This is review for most, but very quickly I'll go through the idea that there's a hear it phase where we have to communicate to people and make them aware of and understand what we're doing and why, and hopefully get to the point where they're accepting and being willing to try new things. There's a believe it phase where we start to see a lot more learning and development and capability building where people are going to acquire and apply new skills and begin to internalize the results. And then and only then do we get to that live it phase where we're starting to see the KPIs move, right? We're starting to see people integrate new ways of working. This becomes business as usual, and the new practices lead to new outcomes. And that's where the CFO starts lighting up because they're going, oh, I see it's working. We know that all this other stuff is a predecessor. This soft stuff leads to the hard stuff. So what we need to now think about in the activation curve from a business point perspective is what do we need to do to actually measure those components? How do we build a business case that links those activities into a consecutive curve that gets us to our destination? So to do that, those of you that have attended the prior workshops, we focused on building an activation plan to bridge that gap. We had our strategy. We've done some of the core planning. We know about the organizational design and how that's going to look. We've got our Gantt charts and our project management. We financed the new tech investments. We now need to actually build a people plan. What is our campaign, our marketing campaign to bring this to life so that we can actually target, engage, integrate, listen to, analyze, and course correct this program to get everybody up the activation curve. Our prior four workshops led us through the how-to. So if you didn't attend those, please go back. We talked about how do we make sure we've got a clear vision for the transformation that we can share with everybody. We talked about how to go in and do that discovery, that stakeholder research from our poll to understand What are the wants and needs of different stakeholder groups, and how do we address those so that they can move up that activation curve? We look for the barriers to change in that phase so that we can mitigate those. We then designed this activation plan we ended up with, which gives us a very concrete picture of exactly how we're going to spend the money, right? So we now have a plan, and we can go in the CFO and say, we're not just asking for a bucket of dollars. We have an activation plan that specifically shares for you what kind of learning, communications, activities, and so on we need to invest for each of these stakeholder groups to help us get them to that tipping point where we can now see the better expected value on our investment. So having this is part of our business case, and this is what we want to build towards as a starting point on the cost side. So now I'd like to transition to how do we build the overall business case? So specifically, after doing a lot of research, after doing a lot of observation, working with companies, I wanted to highlight what I'll call sort of the big seven. So there's seven key areas that you can look to understand how do I build a business case for my particular transformation. The business case is out there, the data is out there. I'm going to share a bunch of data in the coming slides, but we know that there's a business case that has a very strong case for change activation and can tie it to the operational and financial benefits. A couple of those arguments include these. So first off, we have evidence to suggest that if you've got an effective change program, you're going to have faster adoption and higher utilization. So in CFO terms, we're getting to the higher net present value for this investment. We're going to get to that outcome we want sooner. And the sooner we reach that, the more money we're going to be making, right? Secondly, we see that there are sources of increased productivity and performance. So what we might see is that achieving these outcomes sooner and faster is going to lead to higher levels of productivity among our employees or higher levels of performance. And those might move things ranging from revenue to NPS score, depending on what our transformation is. Third, we also know, because we're moving ourselves out of that 80% that fail into that 20% that succeed, that these investments have a direct correlation to reduced risk of project failure. So that $10 million the CFO is spending, for $250,000, they can buy an insurance policy, right? I can now say, this activation plan is an insurance policy. It's going to cost you $250,000 more, but now you've spent 11.25 million instead of 11 million to get 50% better chance of being successful. So that reduced risk of project failure is a real argument. We also know that if we do this well, we're going to have higher employee engagement and retention, especially in things like mergers and acquisitions. Retention is one of the biggest hidden costs. So if we can show through our evidence that we can actually decrease the attrition in a merger, increase the employee engagement and retention through any change initiative, we've got a strong business case that's quantifiable. Fifth, increased ROI in technology and process investments. And this is just what it says, right? We've got a likelihood that if we actually achieve this goal, we're going to probably have outsized outcomes. And we saw that in the math before. So how do we build a business case that can describe that and quantify that based on the numbers we know we're spending? Importantly, as a strategic advantage, we see that organizations that do change activation well experience enhanced customer experience, and it creates a competitive advantage vis-a-vis their competitors, right? So if we're doing better by our customers, we're more likely to have more sort of brand affiliation, loyalty, and long-term customer value. And then lastly, for those of you that are in sort of high compliance environments, we also know that this is a faster path to getting in line with compliance and risk mitigation. And there are costs if we don't do those things. So these are all areas we can look to. The other thing I want to highlight too is that we're in an age of technology where there's some level ups that we can consider. So looking at some of the technology benefits of using AI, for example, or deploying systems and processes to enable us to do some of this stuff faster and better, we can potentially quantify how much time we can save for our OCM teams in building change communications, for example, because they can automate more of that, create derivatives using AI, other things. We can probably reduce costs for things like translation and localization, which can run into the tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars on a major program. We can get faster insights and data analytics. We can possibly consolidate some of our technologies to deliver more things in one place. And generally, AI will drive productivity across the spectrum. So what I'm going to do now is take us through each of those seven and just give you basically a bang box, a highlight, a number that you can take away that you can start to use for your rough calculations of what this might be worth. Importantly, each of these seven things may not apply to your particular change initiative. But what I want you to do is have all seven of them in your mind because for each change and transformation, one, two, or three of these things might really resonate. So, for example, in that case where we were talking about a merger and acquisition, that employee retention issue is front and foremost, and we can quantify what it's worth. So what I've done is I've looked at a number of different sources and then tried to build out an estimate of kind of a base case that we can use as a prompt to start to build our business cases. In the case of faster adoption and higher utilization, there's been a lot of studies to understand what this is worth. But the bottom line is you can assume, based on all the research that's out there, that we can have a 40% faster time to adoption and achievement of ROI if we implement an effective change activation program. If we look at our next category, increased productivity and performance, based on lots of research that's out there from sources like ProSci and McKinsey and others, we have a bottom line assumption that we can assume productivity goals 30% faster if we implement change activation and an effective change management strategy than if we didn't do it. So if we know from the CFO that my expected productivity and performance is this, we can say, what's that worth to you if we get there 30% sooner, right? Or rather, if we get there 30% faster to that goal, those days, those months, from a net present value perspective, are worth something, and we can quantify that. Reduced risk of project failure. What if we can move from that 20%, 50%, or 80% category? We can calculate the expected value of that, right? So if we know that this is worth 50 million and we can increase our chances of achieving that goal, but if we don't do that, we're down here in the losing 11 million. We now can say there's $61 million at risk here. And let's talk about what the reduced risk of project failure is worth. We can quantify that. The bottom line here is that a company that applies structured change management practices can triple its chances of success, shifting from a 30% success rate to an 80 to 90% success rate in their transformation efforts. That's a number you can calculate. Around higher employee engagement and retention. This one, again, in the example of like mergers and acquisitions, but frankly, in all change, people get scared, right? So in all change efforts, looking at these numbers are important because not only do we not want to lose people, but typically when we lose people in a change effort, we lose our top performers first. So the bottom line here is that good change management reduces preventable turnover by 50 to 75%, and it increases employee retention from the 40 to 60% that we see with poor change programs to 80 to 90% that we see with good change programs. By the way, just a note, as it's come up, I do have the sites for these data points at the end of the deck, so we will share that out. So you can go back and read these reports for yourself. So you've got some good evidence as you build your business cases. Next, increased ROI in technology and process investments. So bottom line here is that what we've seen in the marketplace and from lots of sources is that those folks that deploy a good change activation and management program can assume a 1.5 higher ROI. So 50% improvement in terms of their ability to reach their ROI targets over their competitors and their peers that don't do the same thing. Those can be calculated. And then one that's near and dear to me is how do we actually support making change activation a competitive advantage for organizations? So I've argued in some recent LinkedIn posts and some blog posts that I've made that I really want the C-suite to start focusing on thinking of change activation as a competitive advantage. If you can build a culture around change, you're going to get there faster and better than all of your competitors. So I think this is important generally, but we also see the evidence that if we do change well, it does result in enhanced customer experience, which creates a competitive advantage vis-a-vis your competitors. So the assumption here that you can use as a bottom line is that if we have effective change activation, we're going to have a 20% improvement and customer satisfaction. And that turns into loyalty and long-term customer value. So those are numbers that we can calculate. And then lastly, in the seven, compliance and risk mitigation. This gives us the ability to start to know what we can reduce in terms of risks. So if you're in a highly regulated environment, one where compliance matters, if you're not doing the right things, you're facing fines, you're facing expenses, you're facing costs. We can actually assume a 50% reduction in risk if we have a transformation effort that's closing one of those gaps and we use effective change activation. The other things I wanted to share is a little bit of data from our experience at Tigerhall. So in seeing our customers and their experience in actually using these systems and processes to deploy change activation, a couple of things that I'd like to highlight in support of arguing for the support of technology and doing a coordinated effort towards this. We've seen that 70 to 80% of change and transformation teams' time spent has been reduced by using technology-enabled tools to support this, things like AI. We've seen clients that have reduced language and translation costs to zero because we can actually automate that inside of platforms within your organization. We've seen higher speed of adoption, as well as the side benefit that the faster we get information and the faster we get adoption and the faster we get data and analytics, the more effectively we can allocate our resources. If we see that this group's already up the activation curve, we don't need to spend that money on them. We can reallocate it to the people that are lagging. For end users, saves time because we don't have as much stuff to go sift and find. We can actually be more directed in terms of how we serve content to people intelligently in a personalized way. So if you've got a targeted approach that's using targeted and bite-sized communications that are speaking specifically to stakeholders, as we've designed through all of our change activation program, those folks are going to get it a lot faster, a lot better, and with a lot less toil and time than if we just made them go hunt and peck around a SharePoint site. And lastly, we have seen significant improvements in terms of employee retention and engaging top talent. So I'm going to close this conversation by giving you a tool. What I'd like to do now is share a business case canvas that you can use to actually start to design your own business case. And again, importantly, every case is different, but the methodology we use can be the same. So the business case canvas is going to be implemented in three ways. Each area, the first one, each area of the canvas has a category of information that are basically the building blocks or ingredients of a business case. So by going through and doing this exercise, you will do the rigorous activity of finding all of the information that you need that could potentially be a building block for your business case. You may not use it all, but you can be sure that you're likely to get asked these questions by the CFO, so you may as well be prepared. Secondly, you're going to have the conversations with your team, right? So now you're going to sit down with your change team, with your leadership team, with others in the organization that are in the know, and start to identify what are the key sources of ROI that are relevant to my change initiative. Not all seven of these will be, but you want to highlight which ones are the most relevant, and those are the places that you want to dig deeper. Then in the final part of the activity, you're going to take all that information and you're going to start to design your business case based on what we've learned. So you can start to design a preliminary business case that says at a high level, these are the costs, these are the investments, these are the benefits and outcomes. Here's the change investments that we need to make to activate this. And we can put that together into what's going to start to shape up to be a model. So here's the tool. This is something that we'll send out to everybody after this session. There are 13 fields in the business case canvas. And so in my experience, these are the things that we need to collect to be able to stand in front of the CFO and say, this is why I need you to write that check. On the left side, we're going to start off by framing the problem. So what's the current state problem that we've got? What is it that we're solving for? Where are we coming from? What is the future state that we're proposing? So what is the transformation itself and our plan to get there? Below each of those, because we need to have that elevator pitch crisp in our minds, we also want to start to gather some data. So what are the current metrics around the current state? So what are the KPIs that we're measuring today and how do they sort of stack up as our baseline or benchmark? On the future state, we want to look at what are the expected metrics. So where do we think we're going to go? If we make these investments, what should those turn into, right? And so between those four boxes, we now have our gap analysis. We have our current state, we have our future state, we have the performance for each, and the expected change that's going to happen. We also want to address the question in the bottom left of what's the cost of doing nothing, right? This is oftentimes one of the best business cases is what is the cost of not fixing this problem, right? If the problem we're fixing is dropping NPS score, we can calculate that this is going to be super expensive if we continue at this pace because the lifetime value attached to every one of our customers can be calculated. And we can say, hey, if we don't do anything, this is the millions of dollars that we're going to lose within the next 3 quarters if we don't address it. So we want to do that math too. We also want to be equipped with the cost to implement our future state solution. So at this point, we may not have all the costs in mind, but we want to have at least a preliminary sense of what are those sources of cost, what are the rough estimates of what those are going to be. Then we want to move to the middle. So we want to start thinking about the benefits. So now we're going to start quantifying the benefits. Why are we doing this? What are we going to achieve with this? What are both the financial and non-financial benefits that we can get out of this? So that's going to start framing the conversation around where our potential sources of ROI come from. You can then dip down with your team and go into those sources of seven sources of ROI that we've just discussed and say, let's just check the box on the ones that we think apply here, because that'll start to give us a sense of which ones we can dig into to start to pull some of those bottom line numbers out to start to estimate the value. Then as we move to the right, we're going to get into some more of the detail that's really going to help us finish out our business case. So we need to estimate the scope of this, right? So thinking about that tipping point again, is this an enterprise-wide change that we're making that we have to activate everyone for, all 50,000 employees? Or is this perhaps a regional or a departmental shift, in which case maybe we only have to reach 10,000 of those employees or 5,000 of those employees? That scope is important because that's going to help us calculate the tipping point when we go over to stakeholders. If we want to get 20% of the folks in our group of 10,000 that we're impacting, we now have a better sense of how many people we need to address and how deep we need to go in terms of our investment in stakeholders. Then in the stakeholder side within that group, we need to say who are the key stakeholder groups? Who are the 20% we need to focus on? Maybe we don't have to get 100% of them, but these 5 stakeholder groups are the most important. And these are the interventions that we need to make. This group needs more training. This group needs a lot of communication. This group we don't need to invest as much in. That's starting for us to shape our change activation scope. We also want to start thinking about the resources we need then to deliver that. So do we have the resources internally to develop the learning and development program for that group? Or do we have to go outside and hire a vendor for that? Maybe we have to spin up an RFP to get something we need. So we want to identify those resources at this stage and start to calculate rough costs there. And then you can't walk into a CFO without an understanding of what are my risks and my mitigation strategies. So in the 12th box, we're going to spend some time thinking about that. With those 12 boxes complete, we now have enough information to start to frame our business case. And the business case will evolve, importantly. So right now, our preliminary business case is going to have a preliminary sense of the expected costs, a sense of the expected benefits. We can start to put some estimate on the likelihood of success. So for example, you might say for a $250,000 investment, we've got a 50% chance of success. For a $1 million investment, we've got an 80% chance of success. It's an estimate, but again, we have data that can support those ranges and help you build that case. And then you also want to make sure we're highlighting what are the non-financial benefits that we might also realize. So are there things outside of just this pure expected value calculation or NPS calculation or whatever you use internally that we should also quantify that might have additional benefits? Employee retention, increased NPS, customer lifetime value shifts, those kinds of things that might actually also be additive to our business case. This you can have as a preliminary starting point, and you should start the conversation right away with the CFO about embedding this into your program. But then as you go through the process of designing your change activation program, you also have now more data because you can start to quantify how those dollars are going to get spent, and you can refine this business case. So the goal here is that you've got a business case right at the beginning of the initiative, and it's a loose model, but it's one that's well thought out. And then as you do the change activation journey and develop your change campaign, you have a specific plan for how those dollars are going to get spent. And those two things together are even more powerful. So that's our goal here. one other thing I'll share out is a sort of a summary grid of some of those bottom line takeaways that we had. So you can use these two things side by side to say, all right, if we're doing, for example, a merger, if we build a change activation plan, I know that I'm going to go to that higher employee engagement and retention and make an assumption that I'm going to reduce turnover by 60%. And given that I know the directory of our organization, I can tell you what that's worth. So we want you to have this quick guide as well to be able to dig into these materials. Okay. One thing I'm going to offer right now as well is if people, I recognize that this can be a little bit challenging to do. I will offer office hours up to anyone that has been attending this session in this workshop. If you want to actually have a conversation about your particular change challenge, I just dropped a link into the chat, and you can feel free to book 30 minutes with me. Be happy to talk about how to go through this with you, where some of the places that might in this grid apply to your change challenge, and give you some initial thoughts on how do we build a business case to help you get the resources you need. So if that's of value to anyone, my calendar's here. Please grab time. I would be very happy to be in service to you to support, your change effort and having that conversation with the CFO. So to close, and then we'll have time for a couple questions. If people have any questions, please drop them into the chat. We want to be able to equip you to do this well. We know that not only are you running one or two change initiatives, you're probably managing multiple change activation plans at once. And to be successful, we've got to start talking ROI. We've got to be able to go into those business meetings and have a opportunity to present our business case for why this is not an add-on, but this is actually a strategic investment to help the CFO reach the final ROI that they're seeking. We want to focus in on some key takeaways here because these are about our own behavior change in this particular case. So the first one is, as change leaders, we need to start reframing the soft stuff into hard stuff. We need to change the conversation. The data shows that effective change activation is actually a force multiplier, but we need to start to evangelize always and often and use data and bring it to meetings quite literally and say, here's what we know. Here's a study that shows if we do this, we can expect better outcomes, better odds. Data wins the day. So we need to reframe that soft stuff into hard stuff. I also want us to change our behaviors to start building this business case early. So often we're brought in at the very end to try to, the consulting firm's been in, they're on the way out the door. Okay, change team, make this happen, right? We need to get into that meeting early on, have a seat at the table, and start building that business case early on so that we can advocate for the change resources from the start and better position these change investments as a strategic investment, not an afterthought. And then lastly, we need to build that activation plan that's going to tip the scales. So when we actually calculate the cost, what we're asking for, right? Is it 250,000? Is it 100,000? Is it 50,000? Well, that depends on what's the number that's going to get us to tip the scales. Let's find that activation plan that specifies the key audiences that we need to get to that 7% to 20% tipping point in the organization. And let's cost out what each of those interventions is going to cost, those building blocks. We now have a very strong business case because we can show exactly what we're doing, where we're targeting it, how those dollars are going to get spent side by side with what we expect the return to be. And now it's a strategic investment. So these are all behavior changes for us to kind of take into account. And I'd be very keen to learn from folks, if you want to reach out to me afterwards and dialogue and tell me what's been working for you, what's not been working, and if people have additional ideas, because this is a topic I'm going to continue to publish on pretty heavily because I think it's one of the most important toolkits as we move into this sort of the next generation. So with that, I would love to open up a couple of questions. I think we've got a few minutes for that. And then I will also, at the end of the slides, I will flash to some of the sources. So we'll get them on the video and then we'll share it out to folks. So if you want to go and look at any of these reports yourselves, you can feel free to do that.
So
All right,
Aric,
Julie.
oh, we're gonna here. Let's start dancing again. So
Yep.
here, I have a question from Nora. One of the key challenges I have as a change manager is that the metrics we use today are not measuring change behavior. So just building on the existing metrics, often these are lagging, and it does not help to drive the change. it does not help me to drive the change. Sorry about that. What are your thoughts on that?
I think this is one of the areas where I think I mentioned in the earlier slide that this has been one of our biggest problems, but this is actually an area that technology is helping us to solve to some degree. So if we think about the activation curve, again, we've got those KPIs, those are present, but those things that happen in the hear it in the believe it phase. So the communications, the learning and development, those sort of things that are early indicators of activation occurring are the things that we have a hard time getting. And it's the thing that's always I've always struggled with as a consultant to be able to bring to bear for my customers. Um, we used to do that through very mechanical analog ways, right? Like, so maybe we would add 3 questions to the employee survey that happened once every 6 months to say, how many of you have heard the strategy and are aware of it? How many of you understand it deeply? How many of you are applying it to your daily work? And then we could use those 3 questions that we got every 6 months to give us an answer that we could use as evidence. Those days are happily ending because now we can actually start to use technology in the way that we're delivering content to our employees to actually track that more effectively. So, as you're thinking about deploying your communications, deploying your capability building, look at the systems that you've got available now to say, how can I track, for example, how many people actually sort of downloaded and read the white paper? How many people downloaded and consumed the podcast? How many people downloaded and viewed the video straight through? That's starting to give us some metrics around awareness. If we can say that, for example, 70% of the product management team has been through all of this content, but only 20% of the sales team looked at it, we can actually go out and use that data to make sure that sales team gets on board, right? We can do the same thing in the learning and development phase. We can start to look at, how many people have taken the course, what was the result of their assessment, how are they performing, are we seeing the changes in their job and their impacts. And we can build some of that in through technology, but we can also start to automate some of the sentiment gathering and some of the surveys right within things like Microsoft Teams or within Workday, so that we are maybe once we see somebody's completed an activity, we can ping them and say, hey, give us the thumbs up and thumbs down on this and your top feedback on what worked and what didn't. From that, we can use tools like AI, for example, to start to digest the sentiment across 10,000 employees. 80% of them really found this tool valuable, 20% of them hated it. Here's why. And these are the ones that are working, these are the ones that aren't, and here's how you can make it better, right? So we can start to gather those kinds of data points. And if we can collectively build listening posts in through the awareness phase and through the believe it phase, we can start to capture the data real time on whether people are actually moving up that activation curve, importantly, number one, and which groups are leading and which groups are lagging. And that data also is going to give us the ability to make the course corrections we need to make more investments and reallocate resources. So I guess my conclusion there is it's getting easier to do this. This is one of the things that Tigerhall does is actually track this data in organizations from awareness all the way to living it. But those systems are existing in lots of different platforms now, and we should start to make technology our friend and find the ways in your organization that you can start to build tracking mechanisms in that are more frequent and more real time than a pulse survey every 90 days. Be happy to chat with you about that offline anytime. All right. Any other questions we should address, Julie?
No, Jeanette said that that was some great information. So we have a few compliments and we have a thank you from Nora, but no more questions for now.
Cool. Well, everyone, I'm really so delighted that you shared this time with me. It's not quite as exciting a topic. Finance was not my best class in business school, but I have found that it is actually the most persuasive evidence to get the resources we need to be effective in our change roles. So thank you very much for sharing this time with me, and we'll share out this content so that you've got it at your fingertips. Again, if you want to sign up and spend any time just chatting about your particular change challenge, I'm available to you. Go ahead and hit my calendar, and I'd be delighted to talk through how we might make some of these numbers work for you. Next week, the finale of the workshop, we're going to be spending some time talking about best practices. So quite literally, over 20 years, I've assembled, these are the things that I've seen companies that have been successful do. And we're going to talk about those buckets of sort of best practices that we can get our leaders to do if they want to be effective at change. So I'd love to have you join me for that. Hopefully you can take some stuff away, not only for yourself, but stuff that you can actually start to populate inside your organization. So definitely sign up if you haven't already. Finally, you've got my contact information. Reach out to me anytime. I'm always happy to be of service in any way that I can. And we will share on this last page the fact base around where some of this data came from in those prior slides. So if it's helpful to you, go read the research, go read the reports, and bring that into your business cases so that you can win the resources you need to make positive change in the world. With that, thank you all. So grateful to have you here, and I look forward to seeing you next week.